An old man in a worn gray coat walked into the city's most exclusive restaurant, a place where money whispered from every polished surface and judgment was served as the first course. They saw his scuffed shoes and his tired cardigan, and they saw a man who had lost his way. The manager, a man sculpted from arrogance and tailored suits, moved to intercept him, a sneer barely concealed beneath a veneer of professional courtesy. He intended to eject the old man with swift, public humiliation to reinforce the golden rule of his establishment. Appearances are everything. What he didn't know, what no one in that room of glittering elites could possibly comprehend, was the story etched into the simple, dark ring on the old man's finger. They mocked the old man, but what happened next would shatter their world, especially for one soldier across the room whose hands began to shake uncontrollably the moment he saw that ring. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The Gilded Lantern was not merely a restaurant, it was a cathedral dedicated to the worship of wealth and influence. Its walls were paneled with dark, lustrous wood imported from some forgotten rainforest, and the chandeliers dripped with crystals that fractured the light into 1,000 shimmering rainbows, each one seeming to mock the dim, ordinary world outside. The air itself felt different, heavy with the scent of expensive perfume, aged leather, and the subtle, mouth-watering aroma of culinary creations that cost more than most people's weekly wages. The patrons were a curated collection of the city's finest, tech billionaires with their unnervingly youthful wives, stern-faced politicians negotiating deals over plates of seared foie gras, and old-money matriarchs whose jewels flashed with cold, ancestral fire. Every clink of silverware against porcelain, every hushed murmur of conversation, was orchestrated to create a symphony of exclusivity. At the center of this opulent universe, conducting it all with an iron will and a perfectly starched collar, was Monsieur Alistair Sterling, the general manager. Sterling was a man who believed in surfaces. To him, the world was a simple binary. There were those who belonged and those who did not. His entire career was built on his unerring ability to tell the difference in a single, sweeping glance. He moved through the dining room not like a manager, but like a predator patrolling his territory, his eyes constantly scanning for any imperfection, any discordant note that might threaten the carefully constructed harmony of his domain. His suit was a masterpiece of Italian tailoring, his shoes shone with a blacker-than-night polish, and the knot of his signature silk tie was a small, perfect fist of silver and blue. He saw a wine glass a fraction of an inch out of place and corrected it with a flick of his wrist. He noticed a diner's napkin had slipped to the floor and materialized a busboy with a nearly imperceptible nod. He was a master of his craft, and his craft was the maintenance of a beautiful, impenetrable fortress for the wealthy. He felt a deep, soul-satisfying pride in his work, a sense of moral clarity in upholding these sacred standards. Tonight, the fortress was about to face a test, and Sterling, ever vigilant, was more than ready to be its unyielding gatekeeper. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was not just managing a restaurant, but protecting a way of life, a fragile ecosystem of elegance that would crumble under the weight of the common and the ordinary. He was a sentinel, and he would not fail in his duty. Into this temple of polished perfection shuffled Arthur. He did not enter so much as drift in, a lone gray leaf blown in from a different, far less glamorous world. The heavy oak door, usually opened by a smartly uniformed doorman, seemed to have let him slip by unnoticed, a momentary glitch in the establishment's otherwise flawless security. He stood for a moment in the entryway, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, slowly adjusting to the dim, golden light. His coat was a simple wool affair, clean but undeniably old, the kind of garment worn for warmth, not for show. Beneath it, a faded brown cardigan was buttoned over a plain cotton shirt. His trousers were simple slacks, and his shoes, though sturdy, were scuffed at the toes and worn at the heels from a lifetime of walking on unforgiving pavement. He leaned gently on a dark, unadorned wooden cane, its surface smoothed by the constant grip of his hand. He was the antithesis of everything the Gilded Lantern stood for. He was a smudge of reality on a carefully painted canvas of fantasy. The whispers started almost immediately. A ripple of distaste spread through the nearby tables. A woman with a diamond necklace that could have funded a small nation leaned over to her husband, her lips curled in a delicate sneer. "My goodness," she murmured, just loud enough to be heard, "have they started letting in the homeless?" Her husband, a portly man with a face made florid by expensive wine, chuckled condescendingly. Across the room, Sterling, who had been overseeing the decanting of a ridiculously expensive bottle of Chateau Margaux, felt a physical jolt, as if a cold draft had just blown through his soul. His eyes snapped to the entrance, and his professional smile froze, then tightened into a thin, hard line of disapproval. He saw the worn coat, the simple cane, the quiet, unassuming posture, and his internal calculus of human worth produced an immediate and damning verdict. This man did not belong. He saw a problem that needed to be erased, a stain that needed to be scrubbed out before it could set and ruin the priceless tapestry of his dining room. With a curt nod to the sommelier, he began to move toward Arthur, his steps smooth, silent, and filled with a sense of righteous purpose. He was the guardian of the gate, and he was about to repel an invader. A young waitress named Clara, who was new enough to still possess a genuine warmth that hadn't yet been crushed by the restaurant's oppressive atmosphere, saw Arthur first. Before the wave of judgment could reach her, she saw not a problem, but a person. She saw an elderly gentleman who looked tired, who perhaps wanted a quiet meal. Her instincts, born of a simple, honest upbringing, told her to help. She picked up a pristine menu, its leather cover cool and smooth against her fingers, and moved toward him with a gentle, welcoming smile on her face. "Good evening, sir," she began, her voice soft and clear. "A table for you tonight?" She was a small island of kindness, in a rising sea of contempt. But before Arthur could even respond, a shadow fell over them. Alistair Sterling had arrived. "Clara," he said, and her name, on his lips, sounded like a shard of ice. He didn't look at her, his eyes were fixed on Arthur, but the command was unmistakable. "That will be all. Return to your station. I will handle this." Clara froze, the menu feeling suddenly heavy in her hand. She looked from Sterling's cold, dismissive face to Arthur's calm, patient one. She saw the injustice of the situation laid bare in that single tense moment. Her training screamed at her to obey, to retreat, and forget what she had seen. But her conscience rebelled. "But, Monsieur Sterling," she stammered, "the gentleman just needs a—" Sterling's head snapped toward her, and his eyes, cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, finally met hers. "Now, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper, "do not make me repeat myself." The threat was clear. Her job, which she desperately needed, was hanging by a thread. Defeated, she gave Arthur a brief, apologetic glance, her own eyes mirroring the sadness she saw in his. She turned and walked away, feeling the stares of the other patrons like a physical weight on her back. She had been a witness to the opening salvo of a battle she was powerless to stop. A small act of decency, extinguished by a much larger, colder force. Arthur had watched the entire exchange without a word, his expression unchanging. He understood perfectly. He had seen this kind of casual cruelty before, in many different forms, in many different places. It was an old and depressingly familiar story. Sterling, having dismissed the subordinate, now turned his full, undivided attention to the problem at hand. He straightened his signature tie, a small, symbolic gesture of reasserting his authority. He manufactured a smile, a thin, artificial thing that did not come close to reaching his eyes. "Good evening," he said, his tone dripping with a condescending sweetness that was far more insulting than outright hostility. "I do apologize for the confusion. Are you, perhaps, a little lost? The service entrance is around the back, if you're making a delivery." He let the insult hang in the air, a perfectly crafted little dart designed to wound and dismiss. He was offering Arthur a chance to retreat, to accept the role of a confused deliveryman, and simply vanish. Arthur, however, did not take the bait. He looked directly at Sterling, his gaze steady and clear. "I am not lost," he said, his voice quiet but firm. A low, resonant sound that seemed to absorb the ambient noise of the restaurant. "And I am not making a delivery. I am here for dinner." The simple, direct statement seemed to throw Sterling off balance for a fraction of a second. It was not the response he had expected. He had anticipated confusion, embarrassment, perhaps a mumbled apology. What he got was calm, unwavering certainty. He recalibrated his attack. "I see," he said, drawing the words out. His voice now laced with mock patience, as if explaining a complex concept to a small child. "Well, you must understand, sir, that the Gilded Lantern is a rather unique establishment. We have a standard to maintain. Reservations are typically required weeks, sometimes months, in advance." He gestured vaguely at the opulent room, at the well-dressed clientele. "It is a certain kind of experience." Arthur's gaze followed the gesture, but his expression remained impassive. He seemed to see through the glittering facade to the brittle egos and hollow posturing beneath. "I am aware," he replied, his voice still even. "I do not have a reservation, but I was assured a table would be available. A table for one, please." The polite insistence, the refusal to be intimidated, began to chip away at Sterling's composure. This was not following the script. The old man was supposed to shrink, to stammer, to retreat in shame. Instead, he was standing his ground, his quiet dignity a form of passive resistance that Sterling found deeply infuriating. The manager's artificial smile began to twitch at the corners. He was a man who was used to his authority being absolute and unquestioned. This quiet old man, with his worn coat and his simple cane, was challenging the very foundation of his world. The manager's patience, thin as it was, finally snapped. The pretense of professional courtesy vanished, replaced by the raw, ugly arrogance that lay just beneath the surface. He decided that this little charade had gone on long enough. It was time to make an example of this man, to remind everyone in the room of the natural order of things. He raised his voice just enough to be clearly audible to the surrounding tables, transforming this private confrontation into a public spectacle. "Let us be frank, shall we?" Sterling said, his voice now carrying a sharp, cutting edge. "An experience like this, it comes with a certain price tag. A significant price tag." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "I would hate for you to be seated, only to find yourself in an embarrassing situation when the bill arrives. Perhaps a more modest establishment down the street would be better suited to your particular budget." The humiliation was now overt, a naked assertion of class superiority. He was no longer questioning if Arthur belonged. He was stating, as a matter of indisputable fact, that he did not. Several diners nearby chuckled audibly, enjoying the little drama, the cruel satisfaction of seeing someone else put in their place. They were on Sterling's side. He was their champion, the guardian of their exclusive paradise. Arthur's calm demeanor did not crack, but a deep, ancient weariness settled into his eyes. He had seen this arrogance before, in the faces of powerful men who believed their wealth and status made them infallible. He held Sterling's gaze, his own quiet dignity a shield against the man's verbal assaults. He was not embarrassed. He was disappointed. He had hoped for better. Sterling, mistaking this quiet contemplation for weakness, pressed his advantage. He felt the support of his audience, the approving glances of the wealthy patrons, and it emboldened him. He was performing for them now, demonstrating his value as the protector of their gilded cage. The stage was his, and he was determined to deliver a memorable finale. The manager took a step closer, invading Arthur's personal space. He gestured with a flick of his wrist, his manicured fingers pointing dismissively at Arthur's simple attire. "Look at you," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is a place of elegance, of refinement. We have a dress code, a standard of decorum. Your ensemble is simply not appropriate. It is a disruption to the ambiance we work so hard to cultivate." Each word was a carefully chosen weapon, designed to strip away another layer of the old man's dignity. He wasn't just poor, he was an eyesore, a piece of unpleasantness that was ruining the view for the more deserving. The room had grown quieter now, the clinking of silverware slowing as more and more people turned to watch the unfolding scene. They were no longer pretending to ignore it. This was entertainment. Arthur listened to the litany of insults, his posture unchanging. He did not flinch, he did not look away. He simply stood there, absorbing the man's hatred, his stillness a stark contrast to Sterling's agitated performance. When the manager paused for breath, Arthur spoke again, his voice still low and steady, yet it seemed to cut through the charged atmosphere with startling clarity. "I am prepared to dine," he repeated. It was the same simple phrase he had used before, but now it carried a different weight. It was no longer a request. It was a statement of intent, a refusal to be moved, a quiet declaration of his right to exist in this space. This infuriated Sterling beyond measure. The old man's refusal to be broken, his stubborn dignity, was a personal affront. It was as if his insults, his power, his entire worldview were simply washing over this man like water over a smooth ancient stone, leaving him completely untouched. Sterling's face flushed with anger. He had played his part, delivered his lines, and the old man had refused to follow the script. He was making a fool of him in his own restaurant. There was only one thing left to do. He would have him thrown out. "That is enough." Sterling's voice was now a sharp, angry bark that echoed through the silent dining room. "I will not stand here and argue with you. People like you simply don't belong here. This is an establishment for a certain class of person, and with all due respect," he said, the phrase a bitter poison on his tongue, "you are not it. I have been patient, I have been polite, but my patience has its limits." He straightened his jacket, his movements stiff with fury. "Now, I must insist that you leave. Immediately. Before I am forced to have you removed. You are making our other guests, our valued guests, uncomfortable." The final insult was delivered. The line had been drawn. Arthur was officially designated as an undesirable, a piece of human refuse to be disposed of. The silence in the room was now absolute, thick and heavy with anticipation. Everyone was watching, their faces a mixture of smug satisfaction, mild embarrassment, and cold curiosity. Clara, the young waitress, stood frozen by her station, her heart aching with a sense of helpless shame. She watched the scene unfold, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, to run over and stand by the old man's side, but she was trapped by fear, by the cold, hard reality of needing her job. She felt like a coward, and she hated herself for it. She hated Sterling for his cruelty, and she hated the silent, watching patrons for their complicity. They were all part of this public execution of a man's dignity, and their silence was their consent. She saw the manager make a subtle gesture to the two burly security guards who stood discreetly near the entrance, a silent command to be ready. The end was near. The old man would be physically ejected, his humiliation complete, and then the delicate symphony of the restaurant would resume as if nothing had ever happened. It was a brutal, efficient, and well-practiced procedure. For the first time since he had entered, Arthur's composure seemed to shift. He took a slow, deep breath, his chest rising and falling beneath the worn fabric of his coat. It was not a sigh of defeat, but a breath of preparation, the kind a man takes before facing a difficult but necessary task. His gaze drifted away from Sterling's contorted, angry face and swept across the room. He looked at the other diners, truly looked at them. He saw the cold judgment in their eyes, the detached amusement, the faint glimmers of pity that were, in their own way, just as insulting. He saw men and women dressed in the finest clothes, surrounded by the finest things, who possessed everything but a shred of basic human compassion. And in that moment, he felt not anger, but a profound and sorrowful pity for them. They were the ones who were truly poor. He then lowered his gaze, his attention finally turning inward. He thought about the reason he had come to this specific place, on this specific night. He was not here by accident. He was waiting. He was keeping an appointment, one that was more important than all the wealth and status in this room combined. He would not be moved. He would not be broken. He would see this through. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out his left hand and placed it flat on the polished surface of the host's stand that stood between him and Sterling. The gesture was simple, yet it commanded attention. And as his hand came to rest in the soft glow of the overhead lights, everyone saw it. The ring. It was not what they would have expected. It was not gold or platinum, nor was it adorned with some massive, glittering gemstone. It was made of a dark, matte metal, almost black, with a weight and a seriousness to it that seemed to defy the frivolous opulence of the room. It was old, its surface worn smooth in places, yet the insignia carved into its flat face was still clear and sharp. It was not a symbol of wealth. It was a symbol of something else entirely, something older, deeper, and infinitely more powerful. Sterling glanced at it with a dismissive sneer, seeing only another piece of cheap, worthless junk. He had no idea what he was looking at. He had no idea that this small, dark circle of metal was about to bring his entire world crashing down around him. Just as Sterling opened his mouth to give the final order to the security guards, the grand oak doors of the Gilded Lantern swung open once more. This time, however, it was not a shuffling old man who entered, but a figure of sharp, undeniable authority. He was a man in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the impeccable dress uniform of a major in the United States Army. His uniform was crisp, the creases sharp enough to cut glass, his medals and ribbons, a colorful testament to a distinguished career. He carried himself with an air of quiet confidence and purpose, his eyes, sharp and intelligent, quickly scanning the room. The effect of his entrance was immediate and profound. The low hum of conversation in the restaurant faltered. Diners who had been sneering at Arthur moments before now sat up straighter, their expressions shifting to ones of respect and admiration. A military uniform, especially one so highly decorated, commanded a different kind of deference than wealth. It spoke of service, sacrifice, and power of a more fundamental nature. Alistair Sterling, ever the opportunist, saw this new arrival, and his brain instantly switched gears. His sneer toward Arthur was replaced by a wide, fawning smile directed at the newcomer. Here was a real guest, an important man, a pillar of the community. This was the kind of clientele he cultivated. He abandoned his confrontation with Arthur mid-sentence and glided towards the soldier, his hand extended in a gesture of effusive welcome. "Good evening, Major," Sterling purred, his voice now smooth as silk. "An honor to have you with us tonight. May I show you to a table, perhaps one with a view?" He was already calculating how to best leverage this prestigious guest's presence, imagining how he would tell the story later. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the two events, the arrival of the humble old man and the arrival of the decorated soldier, were not just connected, but were about to collide with the force of a thunderclap. The major, whose name according to the polished brass tag on his uniform was Evans, paid absolutely no attention to the fawning manager. His eyes continued their methodical sweep of the room, a practiced scan that was clearly searching for a specific target. He ignored Sterling's extended hand, his sycophantic greeting, and the curious stares of the other patrons. His focus was absolute. And then, his eyes found what they were looking for. They locked onto the small, quiet drama being played out at the front of the restaurant. He saw the two security guards beginning to move. He saw the manager's posture of aggressive dismissal. And he saw the old man, standing there with a quiet, unshakable dignity, his hand resting on the host's stand, the dark ring on his finger catching the light. Major Evans stopped dead in his tracks. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the disciplined soldier vanished. His professional bearing, honed by years of training and the crucible of command, evaporated, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw went slack, and his eyes widened in disbelief. It was as if he were seeing a ghost, a figure from a legend stepping out of the pages of history and into the garish, overlit lobby of a restaurant. The other diners watched, their confusion mounting. They couldn't understand the soldier's reaction. What could possibly connect this heroic military figure with the shabby old man who was about to be thrown onto the street? Sterling was the most baffled of all. He had been completely ignored, his offer of a prime table left hanging in the air. He turned to follow the major's gaze and saw that it was fixed on Arthur. "Major?" Sterling asked, a note of confused irritation creeping into his voice. "Is something wrong?" But Major Evans didn't hear him. He had already started moving, his path straight and direct, his purpose clear. He was not walking toward a table. He was walking toward the old man, and with every step he took, the silence in the room deepened, the tension stretching to a breaking point. Something profound was about to happen, and everyone in the room, from the richest tycoon to the humblest busboy, could feel it. The journey from the restaurant's entrance to the host's stand was only a matter of 20 feet. But for Major Evans, it felt like a pilgrimage. He moved with a reverence that was utterly at odds with the setting. The other patrons, Sterling, the security guards, they all faded into an insignificant blur. There was only the old man and the ring. As he drew closer, he could see the ring's insignia more clearly. The simple, powerful emblem of a solitary star shielded by a pair of eagle's wings. His heart began to pound against his ribs, a frantic, hammering rhythm that he hadn't felt since his first time in combat. His breathing grew shallow. His hands, the same hands that could expertly field strip a rifle in the dark or hold a satellite phone steady while calling in an airstrike, began to tremble. It was a small, almost imperceptible tremor, but to him, it felt like a seismic event. He, a decorated officer, a man who had faced down death without flinching, was shaking in the presence of a quiet old man in a worn coat. He finally reached the table. He did not speak. He simply stood there for a long moment, his eyes locked on the dark metal band on Arthur's finger. All the stories he had ever heard, the whispered legends passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next, the almost mythical tales told around late-night fires in forgotten war zones, they all came rushing back to him. The Sentinels. The Founder. The First Knight. He had always assumed they were just that. Inspirational stories, morale-boosting myths. But they were true. It was all true. And the living embodiment of that legend was standing right here, in front of him, about to be thrown out of a restaurant for the crime of being poorly dressed. A wave of shame and righteous fury washed over him. With a sound that was like the snapping of a whip, Major Evans clicked the heels of his polished boots together. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, his chin tucked in. He raised his right hand in the sharpest, most impeccably correct salute he had ever rendered in his entire life. It was a gesture of ultimate respect. A salute not to a superior officer, but to an icon. His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with an emotion that no one in the room could quite decipher. It was a mixture of awe, reverence, and disbelief. "Sir," he said, his voice ringing out with absolute clarity in the dead, silent room. "It is an honor." Alistair Sterling stared, his mouth hanging open, his mind utterly incapable of processing what he was seeing. The scene before him was impossible. A highly decorated major was saluting with a reverence Sterling had never witnessed before, the shabby old man he had just been about to eject. The world had turned upside down. "Sir?" he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. "Major, what is the meaning of this? Do you know this? This man?" He was flailing, desperately trying to find some logical explanation. Some way to put his perfectly ordered world back together. The major did not break his salute. He did not even glance at Sterling. He kept his eyes fixed on Arthur, as if awaiting a command. But he answered the manager's question, his voice cold and hard as steel, each word a hammer blow against Sterling's arrogance. "Know him?" the major said, a harsh, incredulous laugh coloring his tone. "Every soldier in the world knows of him, even if they don't know his face. We know the legend. We know the ring." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the suffocating silence. "You are standing in the presence of General Arthur Wellesley, the founder and first commander of the Sentinel program. The man who wears that ring is not just a soldier. He is a living monument to the very ideals of service and sacrifice that this country was built on." The name, General Arthur Wellesley, meant nothing to Sterling or the other diners. But the title, General, and the absolute, unwavering conviction in the major's voice was enough. A collective gasp swept through the room. The full, crushing weight of Sterling's catastrophic misjudgment was beginning to become clear. The major continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "This man has saved more lives, influenced more history, and shown more courage than everyone in this room combined. He has advised presidents you've only seen on television. He has commanded operations that will never be declassified. His budget," he spat the word out like a poison, is a private endowment so vast it could buy this entire city block, including this pretentious little restaurant, and turn it into a parking lot without him even noticing. He doesn't wear his wealth. He doesn't need to. His character is his currency. He finally turned his head, his eyes burning with a cold fire as they met Sterling's. And you were about to throw him out because you didn't like his coat. The aftermath of the Major's words was not an explosion, but an implosion. All the arrogance, the smug certainty, the entire carefully constructed world of Alistair Sterling collapsed in on itself in a single horrifying moment. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty gray mask of pure, unadulterated terror. His knees felt weak, and he unconsciously gripped the edge of the host's stand to keep himself from falling. He looked at Arthur, at General Wellesley, and for the first time, he truly saw him. He didn't see a shabby old man anymore. He saw a figure of immense, terrifying power, a quiet giant whose true stature he had been too blind and too stupid to recognize. The whispers in the restaurant had started again, but their tone had changed completely. The earlier sneering and condescension had been replaced by frantic, shocked murmurs. A general? Did he say Wellesley? Oh my God! What has he done? The diners were now looking at Sterling not with approval, but with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was no longer their champion. He was a fool, a clumsy oaf, who had committed a social and professional sin of catastrophic proportions. His career was over. He knew it. Everyone knew it. He began to stammer, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a desperate, incoherent flood. General, I am so sorry. I had no idea. Please, forgive me. It was a misunderstanding, a terrible, terrible mistake. His apologies were pathetic, the desperate babbling of a drowning man. He was begging for forgiveness, for a way to undo the last 10 minutes, to turn back time and greet the general with the groveling respect he now knew he deserved. But it was too late. The damage was done. The beautiful, impenetrable fortress he had so carefully guarded had been breached, not by an invading army, but by his own colossal arrogance. And he was standing alone in the ruins. General Wellesley, who had stood silent and impassive throughout the Major's explosive revelation, finally lowered his hand from the stand. He gave Major Evans a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent command to be at ease. The Major reluctantly lowered his salute, though he remained standing at rigid attention. The general then turned his gaze back to the crumbling, pathetic figure of Alistair Sterling. His eyes held no anger, no triumph, no desire for revenge. Instead, they were filled with a deep and profound disappointment, which was, for Sterling, a far more devastating judgment than any shouted recrimination could ever be. When the general spoke, his voice was the same as before, quiet, calm, and steady. But now, every person in the room hung on his every word, as if it were a divine pronouncement. "There is nothing to forgive," the general said, his voice filling the silent space. "You were simply doing your job as you saw fit. You were protecting your establishment's standards." Sterling looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. Perhaps he could be saved. But the general continued, "The failure was not in your intent, but in your vision. You see this," he gestured to Sterling's impeccably tailored suit, "as a uniform of authority, a symbol of your power to judge, to include, and to exclude. But you are mistaken. A uniform, whether it is that of a soldier or a restaurant manager, is not a symbol of power. It is a symbol of service." He let the word hang in the air. "Your duty is not to judge the worth of the people who walk through that door. Your duty is to serve them, to offer them hospitality, respect, and a moment of peace. You failed in that duty tonight. You were so blinded by the cut of my coat that you failed to see the content of my character. You judged the cover, and in doing so, you betrayed the very story you were meant to be a part of." He was not shouting. He was not even angry. He was simply teaching, delivering a final, devastating lesson with the calm precision of a master instructor. And for Sterling, every quiet word was a fresh twist of the knife in the heart of his professional pride. Just as the general finished speaking, a new figure bustled into the restaurant. He was an older man, stout and red-faced, dressed in an expensive but slightly disheveled suit. This was Mr. Dubois, the owner of the Gilded Lantern. He had been upstairs in his office, and an aide who had accompanied Major Evans had discreetly gone to fetch him the moment the situation began to escalate. Dubois was a man who enjoyed the fruits of his success, a shrewd businessman who was usually content to let Sterling handle the day-to-day operations. But the message he had received from the Major's aide had sent a jolt of pure adrenaline and terror through his system. Mr. Dubois was a civilian now, but he had served in the military in his youth, and he had connections. He knew exactly who General Arthur Wellesley was. He had heard the name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in boardrooms and at private clubs by men who controlled armies and nations. The idea that this living legend was in his restaurant and was being harassed by his manager was a nightmare of epic proportions. He rushed forward, his face a mask of frantic apology. "General Wellesley," he boomed, his voice overly loud. "A profound honor, sir. I am Jean-Luc Dubois, the owner. I cannot begin to express my apologies for this unacceptable lapse in hospitality. Please, allow me to escort you to my personal table immediately." He shot a look at Sterling that was pure venom. He was already composing the manager's termination letter in his head. General held up a hand, stopping him. "That will not be necessary, Jean-Luc," he said, his use of the owner's first name indicating a level of familiarity that made Sterling's blood run cold. "Major Evans and I were just about to be seated." He then looked back at Sterling, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "As for your manager," the general continued, his tone thoughtful, "firing him would be the easy solution, but it would be a waste. He has just been given the opportunity for a very valuable education. I would hate to see him squander it." Dubois looked confused. "Sir?" The general's gaze was fixed on Sterling. "I do not believe in simple punishment. I believe in redemption. This man," he said, "prides himself on his position, on his authority. He looks down from a great height. Perhaps what he needs is a change in perspective, a chance to learn what service truly means from the ground up." He paused. "I would suggest he be reassigned to the kitchens. Let him start as a dishwasher. Let him learn the names and stories of the people he never saw, the ones who do the real work that makes a place like this possible. Let him learn humility from the bottom of a sink full of dirty dishes. Then, and only then, will he be fit to serve your guests again." The proposition hung in the air, a sentence far more creative and, in its own way, far more brutal than simple termination. For a man like Alistair Sterling, whose entire identity was built upon his title, his suit, and his position of authority over others, being sent to the kitchens was a fate worse than death. It was the ultimate humiliation, a complete and total stripping away of his status. He would go from the conductor of the symphony to the man scrubbing grime off the instruments. He would be invisible, anonymous, a ghost in the machine he once so proudly commanded. Mr. Dubois, the owner, looked from the general's calm, resolute face to Sterling's ashen, horror-stricken one. He was a businessman, and he instantly understood the genius of the general's suggestion. It was a perfect solution. It punished Sterling, it placated the legendary general, and it would become a story, a new legend for the restaurant itself, a cautionary tale about pride and a lesson in humility. "An excellent suggestion, General," Dubois said with a decisive nod. "Consider it done, Mr. Sterling. You will report to the head chef tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. sharp. You will be issued a new uniform." The finality in his voice was absolute. Sterling's world had been completely and irrevocably shattered. He looked at the general, at the man who had so thoroughly and quietly dismantled his life. But in that moment, something shifted in his eyes. The terror began to recede, replaced by a flicker of something else. It was a dawning, agonizing understanding. The general was right. He had been so focused on looking down on others that he had never bothered to look up, or even to look around. He had built his identity on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just come in. With a choked sob, he slowly, stiffly, nodded his head. "I understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I will be there." He did not argue. He did not beg. He simply accepted his fate. It was the first truly humble act of his adult life, and it was the first painful step on a long, arduous road to redemption. The comeuppance was complete, not with a vengeful firing, but with the quiet, devastating imposition of a lesson that would change him forever. 6 months passed. The Gilded Lantern had undergone a quiet but profound transformation. The story of that night had spread like wildfire through the city's elite circles and the hospitality industry. It had become a modern parable. The restaurant, once known primarily for its exclusivity and astronomical prices, was now gaining a new reputation. One for warmth, dignity, and a surprising level of humility. On the wall near the entrance, framed in elegant gold leaf, was a new mission statement titled, "The Founder's Mandate." It was a simple, eloquent text, rumored to have been written by General Wellesley himself, that outlined the restaurant's new core principle. True class is not in the price of the meal, but in the character of the company. All who enter with respect in their hearts are honored guests here. The change was palpable. The staff seemed happier, more relaxed. The oppressive atmosphere of judgment had lifted, replaced by one of genuine hospitality. And at the forefront of this new era was Clara, the young waitress who had shown Arthur that initial moment of kindness. Mr. Dubois, deeply impressed by her character and guided by a quiet suggestion from the general, had promoted her. She was now the head of service, the position once held by Alistair Sterling. She moved through the dining room with a quiet confidence and a genuine smile, ensuring that every single guest, from a billionaire in a bespoke suit to a young couple celebrating their first anniversary on a tight budget, was treated with the exact same level of warmth and respect. She had not forgotten the lesson of that night, and she had made it the cornerstone of her leadership. The culture of the restaurant had been fundamentally reborn, a systemic change that had grown from a single, quiet act of defiance against casual cruelty. One evening, a young family entered the restaurant. They were dressed neatly, but in the simple, inexpensive clothes of a working-class family. It was clear they were celebrating a special occasion, their faces a mixture of awe at the opulent surroundings and anxiety about whether they truly belonged. A year ago, they would have been met with a cold stare and politely, but firmly, turned away. Tonight, however, they were greeted at the door by the host. He was a man in a simple, well-kept dark suit, his posture humble, his smile gentle, and completely genuine. "Welcome to the Gilded Lantern," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "We are so glad to have you with us tonight. Right this way." It was Alistair Sterling. He was a changed man. The 6 months in the kitchens, surrounded by the heat, the noise, and the unpretentious camaraderie of the cooks and dishwashers, had stripped him bare. He had learned the names and stories of the people he had once considered invisible. He had learned the dignity of hard, honest work. He had scrubbed pots, mopped floors, and felt the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from a 12-hour shift on your feet. He had been humbled, but in that humiliation, he had found a new, more solid version of himself. He was no longer a gatekeeper. He was a host, in the truest sense of the word. He led the family to a comfortable table, making them feel not just welcome, but truly honored. As he turned to leave them with their menus, his eyes drifted to a quiet corner table. General Wellesley was sitting there, nursing a cup of tea. Their eyes met across the room. Sterling gave the general a small, respectful nod, a gesture filled with gratitude and a profound, unspoken understanding. The general returned the nod, a faint, approving smile touching his lips. The lesson had been learned. The redemption was real. The circle was now complete. As the evening wound down, Major Evans joined the general at his table. He had been in the city for a military conference and always made a point to visit when he could. He looked around the transformed dining room, at the relaxed, happy faces of the diverse clientele, and shook his head in quiet amazement. "It's incredible, sir," he said. "What you did here. You didn't just get an apology, you changed the entire institution." The general took a slow sip of his tea, his gaze thoughtful. "One person can't change an institution, Major," he replied, his voice as calm as ever. "But you can introduce a better idea. All I did was remind Mr. Dubois and Mr. Sterling of an idea they had forgotten, that a business based on making people feel small will eventually, itself, become small. A business that lifts people up, that offers them dignity, has no ceiling on its growth. He looked at the redeemed figure of Sterling, who was now graciously helping an elderly woman with her coat. "Strength isn't about how high you can climb," the general continued. "It's about how many people you can help up with you. True power is never taken. It's given, freely, by those who trust and respect you." Mr. Sterling tried to command respect through fear and exclusion. Now, he earns it through kindness and service. One path leads to a lonely, brittle throne. The other leads to a community. He placed his cup down and looked at the young major, his eyes filled with the wisdom of a long and storied life. "Never forget that, son. The uniform you wear, the rank on your shoulder, it's a sacred trust. Use it to build bridges, not walls. That is the only legacy that will ever truly matter." The restaurant, once a symbol of division and arrogance, had become a quiet testament to this hopeful philosophy, a place where a simple cup of tea could hold a lesson for a lifetime. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were judged unfairly, simply based on how you looked or what people assumed about you? How many times in our own lives have we glanced at a stranger and written an entire story about them in our minds, a story based on nothing more than the clothes they wear or the car they drive? The story of General Wellesley and Alistair Sterling is a powerful reminder that the most valuable things a person can possess, courage, integrity, kindness, and character, are invisible to the eye. They cannot be bought, tailored, or displayed in a vault. They can only be demonstrated through action. What does true worth really look like? Is it found in the glitter of a diamond or the quiet strength of a helping hand? We live in a world that constantly pushes us to judge, to categorize, to build walls between us and them. But what would happen if we chose to see things differently? What if we chose to look past the surface and search for the dignity that exists in every single person? The greatest heroes are often the ones you would never notice in a crowd. The deepest wisdom is often spoken in the quietest voice. The next time you have the chance, choose kindness over judgment. Choose curiosity over assumption. You may not change the world in a single day, but you might just change someone's world for a moment. And that is where all true and lasting change begins. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear this message, and tell us in the comments below about a time you witnessed an act of kindness that changed your perspective. Subscribe for more stories that inspire us to be the best versions of ourselves.